Good evening, and welcome to the Marian Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Michael Grauske, and I am one of the Ath Fellows this year. In recent years, the United States and the Western world have come to associate terrorism with the Middle East more than any other region. Nonetheless, the fact is that sub-Saharan Africa has one of the highest rates of terrorism of anywhere in the world. Nigeria, for example, currently ranks number 3 on the 2016 Global Terrorism Index, and although estimates vary, it is thought that Boko Haram has killed more than 15,000 over the course of the last several years. Here tonight to discuss violent extremism in sub-Saharan Africa is Adote Akwe, the Managing Director for Government Relations for Amnesty International USA, where he has focused on human rights and US foreign policy towards Africa since 1988. Outside of Amnesty International, Mr. Akwe has served as a senior policy advisor for CARE USA and the regional advisor for CARE's Asia Regional Management Unit. He also has served as the Africa Director for the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and prior to that, as the Research and Human Rights Director for the America Committee on Africa and the Africa Fund. Mr. Akwe received his master's degree in international relations from the College of William and Mary and his bachelor's degree from the State University of New York College at Purchase. Mr. Akwe's Athenaeum talk is co-sponsored by the McGrublian Center for Human Rights. As always, audio and visual recording is prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Adote Akwe to the Athenaeum.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the McGrublian Center and the Amnesty International Group for finally making the stars align and bringing me out here. And I'd also like to thank all of you, especially the students who I've had the pleasure of talking with over the last couple of days, for making this such an enjoyable and reassuring experience. Escaping from Washington, D.C. has been one of the best things that's happened to me. When we were thinking about doing this event, I don't think any of us could have imagined the context in which I would be speaking. And just this evening, sitting at our table, one of the more interesting questions was, how had my work changed in the last couple of weeks or since November? And there's a direct correlation between the change in the political leadership here in the United States and the issue that we're addressing. And we'll probably come back to that, but I think it's first important for us to talk about defining the threat of extreme violence or of terrorism, and then potentially look at what that has resulted in terms of the rule of law and human rights, and then speak specifically to some of the key threats that are facing Africa. And I am going to be approaching this as a representative of a human rights organization that seeks to see the rule of law applied fairly and equally, and seeks to see individual rights protected. And I do not do that obviously in a vacuum. There are genuine and very, very scary security threats that are linked to groups that conduct acts of terrorism. But there are also consequences with the counterinsurgency or the counterterrorism effort. Now, if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, the continent has unfortunately known many armed groups, and it's had many threats to security. You've had armed groups that have committed atrocities in Sierra Leone, the Revolutionary United Front that had a notorious habit of chopping people's hands off. You had Renamo, which was an armed military group in Mozambique, sponsored by the apartheid state of South Africa at the time, that conducted brutal bombing raids against liberation fighters and the ANC in its regions. You had armed groups in the in Liberia. So the issue of armed groups is nothing new, and the issue of human rights abuses is nothing new. One of the more infamous ones that you might know is the Lord's Resistance Army, which was the subject of a major US intervention and unfortunately is still somewhere lost in the Central African Republic. But what we're facing now and what we're talking about is a different kind of armed extremist group. It is one that is linked not only to the possibility of destabilizing the country and the region that it operates in, but potentially beyond. In other words, they are potentially linked to larger global networks that make immediate the threat to countries as far away as the United States and Europe. In other words, there is a larger cohesion that people in government are very concerned about. The other significant difference is that there is, or there has been, the use of a religious ideology as an organizing basis. And that has changed it from, say, wanting to address political or economic marginalization, or even to conduct criminal activities or piracy. The groups that we're talking about now are seeking, or purportedly seeking, to create Islamic fundamentalist states. They are seeking to eradicate cultures that they consider alien. They consider the expulsion or elimination of non-believers as not only justified but a necessity. And so when you have that kind of mindset, it's quite arguable that the rules of war, the standards that have been created by the international system on what's acceptable, even in conflict or in armed activities, no longer seems valid. And this may be one of the reasons why some of us are having such a hard time understanding why terrorist groups do the things that they do. So, in response to that, after the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched the war on terror. And that had significant impacts on not only the conduct of conflict against these terrorist groups, but also on the rule of law and human rights globally. What did the Bush administration do? They basically defined terrorist activities as anywhere in the world where potential threats could be organized, where groups that had solidarity or acted in support of al-Qaeda could be located, and made them legitimate military targets. That meant that the global battlefield, that the entire world was now indeed a global battlefield. And that, in addition to that, the Bush administration began to actually put in place the structures that we now associate with the war on terror. For example, the use of bilateral agreements that allowed renditions of people. In other words, suspects or people who they thought were indeed going to be dangerous were now fair game for the security forces in other countries to arrest in violation of their own constitutional rights in their countries or international human rights standards. They could be sent to third-party countries for extreme interrogation, or they could be brought to the United States and sent to Guantanamo, which in itself was a direct creation of the war on terror. A holding facility that is not US law and it's not international law, but seems to be an unending detention facility outside of any jurisdiction. Another consequence of this was the use of surveillance. Many of you probably see the debates and discussions here about metadata and access to people's files. You may recall the whole debate over the cell phone of one of the persons who committed an act of terror here in the United States. Those discussions aren't even happening in other parts of the world. The governments have the access to and utilize their ability to search people's cell phone usage, their internet, and in certain cases, act on that information. So the due process and any concerns about the right to privacy have been severely eroded. In addition, the United States, under the Bush administration and under the Obama administration, turned what I would call is a blind eye towards legislation that was claimed to be focused on countering terrorist threats. And these were usually laws that restricted association, assembly, and expression. These were laws that banned civil society groups that critiqued the government or even reported about terrorist activities. These were laws that ostracized or outlawed political parties that were considered to be major threats to the ruling governments. One of the countries that I work on very closely is the country of Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government has used a law called the Societies and Charities Act to eradicate, to basically shut down all forms of human rights activity by civil society groups in Ethiopia, even ones that provided legal defense for women who were the victims of domestic violence, all justified as needed in the war against terror. And this, of course, was sanctioned not only or blessed by the Bush administration and subsequently by the Obama administration. Now, the other aspect of this has been that the military and the military-industrial complex here in the United States has seen a wonderful opportunity of expansion. And I probably shouldn't use the word wonderful, but there was clearly a decision that in addition to enabling governments in foreign countries to more effectively control their borders and control their populations and thereby negate the risk of terrorist-like activities, there was also going to be the need for capacity, military capacity. You can't fight terrorist or armed extremist groups if you don't have guns and bullets. And that has been one of the more dramatic expansions in sub-Saharan Africa, the expansion of the US military on the continent. The US has had a major expansion in East Africa where it's partnered with Kenya and with Ethiopia, in particular to counter the role and activities of Al-Shabaab, which is a group I'll talk about a little bit later. It has partnered with the Nigerian government and the Cameroonian government and the Chadian government to try and counter the effects of Boko Haram. And it has also worked very closely with France and with the government and the armed forces of Mali to try to counter the effects of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, AQIM. Now, what are the consequences of some of these US policies? Well, first of all, what I've just mentioned is a huge expansion of the military side of it, but not the civilian and democracy side of it. And what does that mean? It means that the budget for US security assistance, measured in the hundreds and hundreds of, possibly even billions of dollars in terms of foreign military assistance, training, equipment, has far outstripped what we would all consider to be the key ingredients of foreign assistance. Food security assistance, humanitarian assistance, democracy and governance, capacity building, core nation consolidating types of initiatives which are essential to good governance in these countries and certainly essential to civilian control and oversight over the activities of the security forces. Those budgets didn't expand. And that is one of the major challenges that we have now, is a major militarization of the US relationship with sub-Saharan Africa, whereby democracy and governance and human rights assistance is way, way behind the security. The other, I think, issue that I would like to talk about, of course, is the lack of accountability mechanisms. When the United States tries to give security assistance to a government, it has filters. It sets standards. There's legislation that prevents taxpayer dollars from facilitating the commission of human rights abuses. But there are also national security waivers. These are the nice loopholes that administrations, laws, US security policies all have that allow those kinds of restrictions to be bypassed. What has that resulted in? Well, in the eastern part of Africa, the armed group Al-Shabaab, which began its operations in roughly around the year 2000, has continued to destabilize what is left of the Somali state, which doesn't have a functioning federal government, continues after all of this time to still be a threat to the peacekeeping force in Somalia at this point. There's no effective accountability for Al-Shabaab's attacks. It is a stalemate, I would argue, between the African Union's peacekeeping force there and the Al-Shabaab fighters. And the African Union peacekeepers are dependent on US security assistance. There's been no effective government, no effective development. The country remains in the limbo that many of us might remember when it fell into back in the early 1990s, when Siad Barre fell from power. The other major organization or terrorist entity that I would like to talk about, of course, is Boko Haram in Nigeria. Now, Boko Haram started off as an Islamic school in the state of Kanuri in northern Nigeria, and very quickly began to espouse a very, very harsh line of religious education and Western exclusion. In fact, the particular focus of Boko Haram's initial work was ending Western-style education, in particular for women and girls. The Nigerian government at the time allowed them to operate, and in fact gave them their blessing because it didn't see them as a potential threat. They thought that they were doing a good humanitarian job of feeding people on the streets and basically taking street children off to education and giving them some kind of positive purpose in life. They began to have a problem with Boko Haram's leadership after about 3 or 4 years, and the Nigerian security forces initiated a crackdown that resulted in the murder of the head of Boko Haram's, the Boko Haram contingent. And very quickly, the Boko Haram members went into the bush, seized arms, and began a military operation against the Nigerian state. What did that initially involve first? Non-violent but non-lethal acts of destruction against government facilities, post offices, schools, hospitals. And then over a period of time, as the Nigerian military did counter-responses, which were quite lethal, Boko Haram began to target actual people, began to do the kidnappings. Many of you know of the Chibok schoolgirls who were abducted, over 200 of them by Boko Haram. The escalation just continued, and eventually Boko Haram began to actually seize and depopulate villages and towns, and the Nigerian military was not able to defeat them. The US continued to provide security assistance, and the Nigerian military continued to do the kinds of responses that any of us would have said were not tactically smart, such as scorched earth responses to sources of information or in villages that were implicated in housing Boko Haram fighters, the arrest of males from the age of 12 to 50 who had to then prove their innocence in very harsh interrogation techniques and were detained for months, even though there was no credible evidence against them, and the use of torture by the Nigerian security forces. What eventually happened with Boko Haram is a very, very stark model of what happens when your counter-terrorism effort is not run properly. There was no real buy-in or support for the Nigerian military in those communities who were seeing their men arrested and being killed and being tortured. There was no real effort to educate or mobilize resources in an effective military initiative. And even when villages were liberated by the Nigerian security forces, security actually wasn't reestablished. The Boko Haram fighters were driven off, but no one could come back and restart their lives and basically produce food. At the moment, I think as the person who announced me said, Boko Haram is said to have accounted for about 15,000 deaths since the mid-2000s. The Nigerian military has accounted for 15,000 on their own. And neither of them has resulted in any kind of accountability or any kind of investigation. So Boko Haram's operations then began to destabilize Chad and began to destabilize Cameroon and also Niger, creating a displaced population of roughly 7 million people. These are now scattered in all of these countries, and they are a major challenge. And worse, the humanitarian response has been lagging. The third armed extremist group that I'd like to talk about is Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, AQIM. And that's the one that many people may not know much about because its moment in the spotlight was very brief. You may recall that there was a time where the country of Mali suddenly was, half of the country was overrun by this armed group. AQIM had been invited in by nomadic Tuaregs of Mali who had felt politically and economically marginalized for decades. And they invited this group in to help them make their point. Their position in this alliance was very quickly overrun, and AQIM began to move further south to try to seek to take over the capital. In response, France deployed a very rapid response military force, stopped the advance, and began to sort of push back with the support of peacekeeping troops from the African Union, what was left of the Malian military, and eventually AQIM was driven back out into the Sahara. One of the things that was most scary about the AQIM initiative was that one was wondering, where did they get the military hardware to conduct this military offensive? And what happened was that they were getting the weapons from the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya that were being trafficked all the way down through the Sahara into Mali, into Nigeria, to Boko Haram, and basically flooding the whole of the Sahel with very cheap and easily available weapons, which created and basically turned what had been a potentially manageable military initiative from the Tuareg into something that destabilized Mali completely, and which has not actually been defeated yet. It just faded back into the desert. So you have these three extremist groups, these terrorist networks, that are still very much active and very much destabilizing large swaths of the continent. And you also have arguably a flawed response from the United States and from the African governments in terms of how to effectively defeat them, or how to effectively reestablish confidence in this nation state and the governments of those countries. What does that mean for this discussion? Well, the first thing is that as we move towards the Trump administration, the argument about the rule of law and human rights becomes much, much more important. If we are no longer going to hold US security forces to certain standards of behavior, and the president has said that. For example, he has said that he supports the use of torture. We'll have to see whether that does translate into policy. Then US allies are going to follow that lead and use much more aggressive and arguably unacceptable techniques of interrogation and of brutally trying to crush the spirit of these armed extremist groups. What you're going to also see is a return to much more scorched earth tactics and possibly an increase in military and security assistance to those countries, even the ones where the government is linked directly to commissions of human rights abuses itself. For the last 2 years, I've been working with a coalition of organizations to try to stop military assistance going to the Nigerian military. Strangely enough, the strongest allies that I had were not from the State Department, and they were not from the White House. They were from the Pentagon. The Pentagon itself was concerned about associating with the Nigerian military because there was such a poor human rights record that they thought that they would be tainted by that. Despite those concerns and effectively stalling the sale of military assistance to the Nigerian military for 2 years, the Obama administration did go ahead and transfer about 24 armed military gunships to the Nigerian military at the end of the year, just before they left office. What is that going to mean in Nigeria? It's basically an endorsement of the strategies of the Nigerian military, of the arrests and the tortures that I mentioned, of the 15,000 plus people who have just disappeared with no accountability, no trials, no change in policy. And also, what does this mean about the Nigerian government's failure on its human rights obligations to the internally displaced populations in the country? Those 7 million people are not just only going to be at risk of starvation. They're going to be at risk of possibly being radicalized, something that the Nigerian military should be extremely concerned about, and something that the United States should be extremely concerned about. In the case of what's going on in Somalia, the strategy appears to be one of containment. It's quite possible that maybe al-Shabaab cannot be military defeated because there's just too much land for them to hide and to run into. But what is being done in the process of containing al-Shabaab in the former state of Somalia, the implication has been that US assistance to Ethiopia and to Kenya, both governments that also have terrible human rights records and a lack of accountability. You may remember that the Kenyan president was indicted and wanted by the International Criminal Court, a case which fell apart. Both of those governments will continue to be the recipients of large amounts of US security assistance. They will continue to be able to control and implement human rights harmful policies in their countries, and there will be the real danger that those countries themselves will become increasingly brittle and could be themselves at risk of internal armed violence as opposition groups, marginalized populations begin to consider taking up arms themselves. One of the largest groups in the country, the Oromo, for example, in Ethiopia, have been waging a mostly peaceful campaign of defiance. And in response, there have been well over 5,000 or 6,000 deaths at the hands of the security forces. No accountability, no trials, no investigation, and certainly no dialogue between the Oromo leadership and the ruling Ethiopian government. So where does this leave us with our counterterrorism efforts in Africa? For an organization like mine, the picture doesn't look very, very good, because we are concerned about the changing dynamic of leadership that you need at the international level to push for human rights and accountability, to try to restrict the worst behaviors of the security forces in these countries. And central to that leadership has been the United States. And I think one of the things that has been consistent in President Trump's rhetoric has been a desire to withdraw from the global role of policemen or of imposing respect for human rights. He said it in many different ways. He said it in ways that have been linked with making America great again by focusing American resources and attention on things that directly benefit the United States. There has been a rejection of the argument that the global community does well, it benefits the United States, and there's increased security. That's something that I believe in, but certainly not one that he does. But we are left with the fact that if the United States is not going to be a primary mover at the UN or in other communities to push governments to behave and to respect fundamental rights, then those governments will no longer feel obligated to respect those rights, and that the security in those regions and in those countries will be falling more and more not to the rule of law, but to force of arms. And if that does happen, then the conflicts between them and armed extremist groups and terrorist organizations is only going to get worse and will only be resolved once one group is completely eliminated, which of course is not possible. So I am going to hopefully anticipate a lot of questions and pushback and challenges to what I've just been saying. I do believe that that there are some silver linings in this rather bleak scenario I put out here. One, I think, has been that there's, outside of the US, there is a regional, a drift towards working together and pulling countries together to respond to these terrorist activities and terrorist organizations. In the Sahel, there is a five-nation conglomeration of nations that are not only sharing intelligence but are also contributing troops. Hopefully troops that will prosecute the conflict and the initiative in a way that respects the rule of law and human rights. In the eastern part of the country, where I mentioned Somalia is being pacified by Ethiopia and Kenya. Hopefully that kind of regional collaboration will continue despite maybe the withdrawal of US assistance, as it's no longer designated a priority. In other words, the rest of the world, I think, still understands that collective security is indeed essential for these kinds of threats that cross borders. The situation with Mali, I think, is a little bit less clear, but I also believe that Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb is probably weaker and doesn't have the ability as much to threaten. But I think one of the things that I would end up by saying is that that there's got to be a fundamental shift away from a military-only type solution to a governance type solution. The lack of the rule of law and economic equality are not the only drivers, obviously, that justify taking up, that create extremist groups, but they're very important. People who do not believe that they have a way of peacefully fighting for their fair share are the ones most likely to consider taking up arms. So if we don't invest in good governance, if we don't invest in the rule of law, if we don't actually walk the talk, then we're losing half of the battle even before we get to it. So I'm hoping that we in the United States are not going to let our government move away from this role, that we as a constituency are going to be able to push the Trump administration and the US Congress to adopt new policies, but not to withdraw from them. And certainly, I hope that we can fight to get a better balance in our foreign assistance mix. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions and commentary. Thank you.
We now have time for questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and Sarah or I will come to you.
Hi, thank you so much for sitting with us. We had a great time, and thank you for your words. I just had a question about how one is to weigh food security, the human rights abuses that you just discussed, and the human rights waivers that you also mentioned against advancing technology like drones within the Obama administration, and state-sanctioned violence, as you mentioned with the African Union and in Somalia.
So let me get the question right. So the balance between state-sanctioned violence, food security, and fighting for food security, and the use of technology. So I think Africa is one of the theaters that has basically been a textbook for the use of technology, and that it's such a huge continent, that there's such a lack of resources, that the use of drones and surveillance and as actually armed deliverers of force is tailor-made for the United States' new high-tech military capacity. The United States has established at least a dozen new drone bases in different countries in Africa. Towards the end of 2016, there was a major drone attack in Somalia that was reported to have killed over 150 fighters in one strike. That is indeed irresistible. And when you go back to the agreements that I mentioned, the bilateral agreements that were designed not only to facilitate the rendition of suspected terrorist suspects, but also to give free overflight access for the US military and the Air Force, you can see that the groundwork was already laid about having the ability to move in very quickly throughout the continent. And in many of these countries, saying no to the request from the Bush administration was not an option. I think the language was either you're with us or you're against us, and that was what was used. So that military technology is here, and while there are movements in many African countries opposing this increased military presence, for the most part, those governments where the bases are very happy to be on the right side of the war of the United States. Now, the question you also asked about food security is a much more complicated one, because that's linked to climate change, changing food production, lowering food production, and also, of course, the cost of conflict on it and its impact on livelihoods and the ability to actually cultivate food. If you take the analysis that conflict disrupts food production and creates instability and weakens economies and makes people poorer, then the strategy that I think is being pursued of containing terrorist groups but not actually resolving and defeating the ideas that give them legitimacy, if there is legitimacy, means that you're fighting only half the fight. You're basically fighting them militarily, and you potentially create martyrs. And you also sow the seeds of further armed groups. So it is, I think what the real question here is the United States at some point going to create, to have the willingness to open up to a much more comprehensive solution of how do you defeat the ideas behind these armed extremist groups, in addition to preventing them from being militarily destructive. And that, I do not see signs of that yet. I think the gentleman with the white coat? Yeah. Oh, okay, great.
Hello, nice to see you. Thanks for talking. We were having a discussion earlier in one of my classes about foreign aid, and I think there's lots of different sides to this discussion. And you talk about us becoming more isolationist with the new administration. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more of your perspective, because I think when I think about the U.S. giving military assistance to other countries, or helping to intervene in certain events, such as Chile with the dictatorship, or many instances in Africa, that seems really negative to me. And so I want to hear a little bit more about your perspective on what the U.S. can do in a positive way, and what it should stop doing in terms of foreign aid.
This is not a human rights authorized response, so stop the cameras. No. I think interventions are complicated. And in fact, I think there are a couple of people here who were in the class this morning where we talked about human rights interventions and how complicated they were. Even the most basic and noble, which is the delivery of food to a famine, is indeed complicated, because if you deliver the food, how are you sure that it's going to be delivered and distributed fairly? What are you going to do to make sure that the conditions that create the famine are reversed, they're changed? Which means, are you going to be able to impact the government so that your intervention is successful? That implies a change of government's attitude or a change of government. Complicated stuff. I still believe very much that the idea that animates the Second World War of global collective responsibility is indeed essential, and that there are times where regional powers or even the state itself doesn't have the capacity to respond to a crisis once it's broken apart, and that at that point, the United Nations or the regional body, in this case the African Union, has to step up and say, we are going to basically try to restore the basic fundamentals of human security to a particular place to help them stop and rebuild and continue. And that's a minimum. We are obligated to that. But it's not, of course, that simple, because what does that mean in actuality? You still have to have a key country play the driving force of leading the intervention, of delivering not only the food, but the security, providing the troops, providing the technology. And that is always linked to a nation's political will or its its definition of its own national security. Now, the U.S. role in Africa may not be as long and as twisted as the colonial powers in Europe, Britain, France, Belgium, even Germany. But it's notable, and it's not been always good. For every intervention around Ebola that the Obama administration did, which was critical, it was the only country that was able to do it, and the president, to his credit, moved quickly, not necessarily with the full support of Congress, but he pulled them along and said, this is not only in our strategic interest, it's the right thing to do. You have the United States intervention in the Congo in the 1960s that removed democratically elected leader and arguably created the chaos that the DRC continues to suffer from today, which is just basically a non-ending mess of competing rivalries and a very weak central government. When I think of the interventions that are necessary, even on this issue of countering violent extremism, I understand and I think appreciate that capacity in those African states is not able to withstand that threat or respond to that threat. The most powerful military in Africa at one point was considered to be Nigeria. They could not stop Boko Haram. They were losing forces. Their own soldiers were defecting. Their weapons were being used against them. Arguably, that this was linked to a very weak elected president, Goodluck Jonathan, but the rots in the Nigerian military was indicative of how weak all of these military states, or these militaries are in many of these African states. So there's no question that capacity and equipment is needed, but that's only part of the solution. And that's where I think we, as a human rights group, we don't carry any weight when we say, you should really be talking about the rule of law. You should be talking about transparency. You should be looking at the social drivers that are making people upset. And you shouldn't be encouraging governments to crack down on political space. Those are the kinds of things that delegitimize governments with their own populations. But that's very academic sounding to policymakers in Washington. And it probably isn't, it doesn't fall on fertile ground because politicians tend to think in its cycles of elections. So if they want a mess to be fixed by the time they're up for their next election, they don't want to talk about long-term institution building. And that's arguably one of the greatest contributors to these crises and to these interventions, and keeping the interventions as much as possible to productive ends and outputs. Is that going to change anytime soon? No. But you're still going to have interventions happening because there's still going to be crises, and there's still going to be a capacity within the former great powers to intervene. And that, I think, is something that we have to figure out. How do we minimize those interventions to being humanitarian ones? And how do you make sure that they actually do what they're supposed to do and not something else?
Good evening. So I have a kind of a four-part question. Bear with me. So I want you to talk a little bit about al-Shabaab's connections to the United States, and then go a little bit further and tell us what al-Shabaab's connections are to ISIS. And then, has the U.S. been successful at blocking off sources of funding to al-Shabaab? And finally, the question of whether or not there are any African countries that are secretly, or maybe not so secretly, sponsoring any of the terrorist organizations you mentioned tonight.
Well, I'll start off with, I'll work my way backwards. When the Nigerian military was suffering such major reversals and failures in fighting Boko Haram, it didn't take long for all sorts of theories to start to emerge about the Nigerian government being linked with, and the Nigerian military. Elements of the Nigerian military were allegedly eager to see Boko Haram succeed because they wanted to see Goodluck Jonathan humiliated and defeated electorally. There were also another theory that a large part of the Nigerian military was from the north, and that the Nigerian military force that had been sent up to fight the Boko Haram threat were from the south, and were therefore happily engaged in human rights violations because they were northerners and they were from the south. They didn't feel obligated to behave professionally. The speculation about whether African countries are involved in sponsoring armed, violent terrorist groups, I think is also linked, of course, with Sudan and Sudan's role in funding the Lord's Resistance Army. That was another major initiative that the United States then deployed special forces into Central Africa to try and find Joseph Kony and arrest him. The theory there was that the Sudanese government was funding the Lord's Resistance Army in retaliation for Uganda's funding of the SPLA, which was, of course, fighting for the independence of South Sudan. So there are always going to be theories and probably just some factual evidence that some governments have engaged in funding armed groups against political rivals. But I'm not so sure whether there is that is the core driver of these groups, or whether it's just one small component of them. Probably more so that they sold them and they gave them weapons, maybe. Now, I think the second point that you made was, how has the U.S. Fared in blocking off funding to al-Shabaab in Somalia? The United States, after the 9/11 attacks, created very sophisticated systems of tracking wire transfers, of tracking bank accounts, of identifying suspicious organizations that were seen to be fronts, fundraising for terrorist groups, and in particular with what was going on in Somalia, which, as we've said, is basically a failed state. What you call the remittances from Somali people abroad is a major source of how people survive in the country. And tracking that, obviously, coming from Europe and coming from the United States is fairly easy. Has that blocked off what al-Shabaab needed to function? I'm not sure. One of the reasons that there was a return to piracy along the Somali coast was basically because al-Shabaab was looking for different resources, different ways of fundraising so it can continue its operations. The organization also has engaged in kidnapping and trying to secure ransoms for foreigners that are abducted. I think that you'll probably see a much more aggressive use of trying to freeze those funds and that support. But I also think that there are other networks that they do and can make use of that keep them, supplied. The more important thing is the arms supplies. And that's actually where the United States and all of these other governments have failed. When we started a campaign to ratify the Comprehensive Arms Trade Treaty, which was to try to restrict the use of the sale and transfer of weapons to governments or to armed groups that were likely to commit human rights abuses, it took us the longest time to get the Obama administration to sign it, even though it was in their own interest to do that, to basically try and curtail the spread of arms. Because at that point, you already had the fall of Libya, and you had Libyan weapons spreading through the Sahel. There was no more a question of, this is what happens when you don't have effective controls over weapons, or you don't sell those, you don't have restrictions on selling those weapons. And that is very much not being enforced or not being adhered to. And worse, there's a real chance that the Trump administration will unsign the Arms Trade Treaty, and if the US pulls out of it, then Russia and China, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, all of the key arms suppliers in the world will basically walk away from that, and groups like Al-Shabaab, groups like Al-Qaeda will suddenly have the return of middlemen who will be willing to sell them weapons, irrespective of how bad that group is. I think your first question was, what are the connections between Al-Shabaab and the United States? And unless I'm wrong, I'm assuming that you're talking about between the Somali expatriate community here in the United States, or are you thinking of something else in terms of being an offshoot of a counterinsurgency effort that was created by the United States? If it's the latter, first let me start. If it's the former, I think that that's an unfair, I would say that there are thousands of Somali citizens who have no connection and I reject Al-Shabaab and we are facing a real potential wave of distrust, which is not fair. And there's no, having people who are radicalized is different from having a whole expatriate community be pro-Al-Shabaab. So I want to take that one off the table. The other, of course, is whether there are former interventions by the United States that have left remnants of an armed group that then comes back to become a problem. This is what people refer to as blowback, where where covert activities by the United States result years later in a problem, as you have in Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen were indeed US allies in trying to push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, and of course became the basis of a lot of the resistance in Afghanistan to the United States. There too, I'm not so sure if there's a connection between the United States and Al-Shabaab. It seems to me that Al-Shabaab's roots are very much from Islamic groups that were frustrated with the lack of governance, and that came together to provide security to their communities, and then over time did become radicalized and became much more aggressive. And certainly in that context in Somalia, where the fight between different clans was so binary, it was either you were on top or you were dead, I think that probably led to some of the early beginnings of Al-Shabaab. But that's probably as far as I can go in saying that there was probably no real no connection between them and former US military operations. That's what I believe.
The last one was,
Is there an actual link? I certainly have heard of and read of that. I do not know whether ISIS has provided any kind of training or any kind of support. I think obviously the ideology is a strong link, or the claims of what they're trying to do. I think that the situation in Somalia is so fluid that it may be more of a verbal, in-principle alliance than anything else. But I would also be the first one to say you probably would want to find out what's going on today, as opposed to me saying, well, at the beginning of 2016, no, there was a couple of exchanges, but there was nothing beyond that. Have I answered all the questions?
Thank you for your speech tonight. I see the war on terror being a retroactive process of creating peace, prosperity, and lack of human rights abuses within countries. What can the United States and further countries do to be proactive in stopping terror, to be proactive in creating peace and prosperity within sub-Saharan African nations?
I think there are some fundamental steps that the United States has to do to address not just the terrorist organizations, but armed extremist groups. As I mentioned, you have, for example, in the Central African Republic, they're not terrorist groups, they're different factions fighting for control. In South Sudan, you have again, the government on the one side and a former militia leader on the other side, and they've destroyed the country. There's a governance challenge in Africa which is fundamental and which cannot be solved externally, but should no longer be facilitated externally. And how do you solve it from the inside? You basically have to try to level the playing field as much as possible so that nonviolent debate, disagreement, dialogue, institution and nation building can happen without fear of being killed. One of the things that since working on this area since 1988, I've been very struck by the perceptions of people to their governments. When I did an interview once on a radio station, and it was on Voice of America, and they had done a very interesting call-in show with people from different parts of the continent calling in to ask questions, and it was about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And they were particularly asking about whether P.W. Botha, the former president, who was the president before F.W. de Klerk, should be compelled to go and testify in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or, as the law said, go to jail. And I, at that time, was young and fiery, and I said, absolutely. Make him testify. How are you going to set the precedent and the example? And then they opened up and there was someone from the Hague War Crimes Tribunal, and he said the same thing, but he wasn't quite as explicit as I was. And then they opened up the phone lines, and people started calling in. 90% of the calls said, no, you cannot send him to jail. This is not right. He deserves respect. Yes, he did terrible things, but no, we don't do that kind of thing to our heads of state, former heads of state. And I was dumbfounded because I didn't understand or appreciate that the perception of government is that it's above the law. The law comes from government, it doesn't apply to government. So the head of state is well above the law. If you can't break that construct down, then government is always going to be able to do whatever it wants, and you are not going to be able to actually have fundamental change in governance in the country, and you're not going to be able to improve governance. And I think that this is where the external facilitation issue becomes so important. If they're getting military assistance to fight bad guys over there, but they're doing terrible things to their own people, you're facilitating. If there's no trial and no independent judiciary to say, stop it, that's a violation of the law, you're facilitating. And this is where you have to have a true discussion over whether the short-term benefit of aiding a strong government because they're fighting the bad guys is more important than a long-term, stable, governing, equitable democracy where the rule of law is respected and where it can resist shocks and challenges just like any other country is supposed to. And I think that that's probably where I would say is where you need to get US policy to move to. But that's incredibly difficult because, you know, the US doesn't have the long-term vision. They deal in election cycles. They don't actually, the logic of saying stable and secure countries in Africa is in our long-term interest is nice and academic. It doesn't work in Washington, D.C., where quote-unquote realists drive the train. So that, I think, for me, is the fundamental challenge of what we need to try to get to.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question. It seems likely that the U.S. influence in Africa will decrease during this next administration. Meanwhile, the influence of China has been growing recently in recent years, massive infrastructure projects and increasing resource development. What role do they play right now working with civil society groups, if any? They have their own long history of human rights abuses, and how do they work with local governments? And do you see that influence growing over the next few years, maybe filling the void that the U.S. might leave? Or do you think that they're just going to be kind of business as usual?
I went to a all-day conference in March in 2016 that invited all of the presidential campaigns to come and talk about Africa, and and to talk about the Obama administration. And then the afternoon was each of the campaigns had a representative, and they were asked, well, what will your presidential candidate do? ... And at that point, I think there were 6 of them. And the representative of the Trump campaign was the last person to speak. And when he was asked the question, he said, what will we do for Africa? Well, Mr. Trump has been very clear that America first. So our approach to Africa will be, what will you do to help America great again? And we were all stunned. We said, he didn't say that, did he? He said it. No, he said it. And the people on the panel looked at him and said, that's the most ridiculous. But as you know, ridiculous things have suddenly become very, very real recently. The US influence in Africa is going to change. It's already changed, because the same technology that we've talked about, and how much quicker and global the world is, and in its interconnectedness, means that first impressions matter a lot. And these are not just first impressions, these are consistent. They've been consistent for a couple of weeks now. The engagement in Africa is going to be much less oriented towards humanitarian, with the exception of obviously emergencies. I think there's going to be further repeals of restrictions that originated out of African crises. For example, the Dodd-Frank legislation that did work on transparency and payments to foreign governments, that was repealed last week. The conflict minerals provisions of the Dodd-Frank legislation, that the groups like mine are anticipating that to also be repealed in the next couple of weeks. The restrictions on assistance, security assistance, which I've already said are full of loopholes and waivers, those will probably be reduced also. There's going to be, but there's going to be more transactional foreign policy, whereby you will do something to help us and you'll get something in return. And in the process, a lot of collective security, collective standards, international and regional prohibitions on bad behavior are going to be weakened. Into that space, you have China and you have Russia. China much more so than Russia, because I don't think Russia has the resources at the moment to project into it, but they're probably watching the Chinese very closely. And the Chinese do have a very, very clear ambition of access to natural resources, access to food production resources, and relationships with government. They're not concerned about what the government does or how it behaves or how it governs. They want a relationship. And in return, as you mentioned, there are large projects, infrastructure projects. There's investment in different industries. There's an opening up of relationships between China's economy and private sector, or quasi-government private sector, and Africa. My country of Ghana is an interesting case in point. We have managed to flirt with both the East and the West. We've benefited from, relationships and things, but the presidential palace was built by China. But one of the major highways was built by President Bush. And we have a new mosque that was built by Turkey. So we will take it from wherever we can get it. But one of the interesting things has been Ghana is a producer of gold, and we have major gold mining facilities, but we also have a lot of informal mining that is, I don't think the word illegal is the wrong word, but it's not above board, and it's not certainly meeting any standards of safety or environmental cleanliness. And that sector is being dominated by Chinese miners. Why would they come to Ghana to come and do mining? This is a story, an interesting story, and potentially creating a backlash that is sort of bubbling. But I think what you're going to have is that China is going to indeed step into the space. It has the resources, and that the United States is going to withdraw, or it's going to make its transactional approach so unattractive that the kind of philosophical or political leverage and leadership that the United States used to enjoy is going to be further weakened. I think the one thing I would say is that one of the most interesting levers that is not going to be weakened, of course, is the one thing that is not actually a policy, and that's the idea of the US lifestyle, which is still transcendent in Africa. Most people don't think about Beijing when they want to live the good life. They think about New York or Los Angeles or something. That is going to be is that going to be a break on governments? No, absolutely not. They will move to the next best source of their support.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask about the recent transition of power in the Gambia, particularly the role that ECOWAS played in facilitating that, and to what extent do you think this might or might not be sort of a replicable model for the future? Thank you.
I was actually at a discussion where ECOWAS's role in Gambia was discussed. I don't know, most people don't follow the Gambia, but it's a very small country. The joke was that you could fire cannon across it from Senegal into, I think, Liberia. It had a terrible dictator for about 25 years, Yahya Jammeh. And Mr. Jammeh conceded the elections. We were all stunned. We were, when the actual night of the election, he realized that he had lost, he announced that he accepted the election results, and then the next day woke up and returned to his own senses and said, hell no. And then created a political crisis where he just said, nope, the elections were flawed, nope, we're going to have new elections, no, I'm still president. And the opposition political presidential candidate had to flee the country for his own safety. And there was surprisingly, ECOWAS did come together, and there was an uproar of, you have to accept these results, you have to get out. And he still defied them. And it wasn't until Senegal began to actually mobilize troops on the border and begin plans to move them into the Gambia that there was another change in his position, and an agreement for safety and safe passage was made. He's now in Equatorial Guinea, having looted most of the treasury, and is now beyond the rule of law. Your point is was the ECOWAS intervention replicable? And I would say probably not, because Gambia, I think, was unique in that it was small enough that they could bully him. It was small enough that the idea of a pecking order, and this is again an informal analysis, that if you could not impose respect for processes with the Gambia, then the whole system was at risk. In other words, larger, more influential countries were not going to basically respect constitutional transitions, non-violent transitions, and elections, and that was going to be a major setback. I think also Mr. Jammeh had lost so much in terms of his regional support base that there were no allies to basically bail him out. Now, the discussion that I was having with people was, what does this mean for ECOWAS? ECOWAS is not supposed to intervene in these kinds of internal disputes. One of the original rules of the African Union and the regional bodies of the African Union is non-intervention in the affairs next door. in countries because you never know what will happen in your own country. You don't want people coming in and kicking you out of power. So non-intervention has been the rule, with exceptions. Idi Amin was ousted by Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. You had the situation in Liberia where Charles Taylor was ousted by military intervention led by Nigeria. You've also had, you've had a couple of them, and it's always been hit or miss because there have been others where you could make the same arguments. For example, what's going on in the DRC, what's going on in Zimbabwe, what's going on in Gabon. All legitimately terrible, oppressive dictators who should have retired and moved on. But the continent didn't mobilize against them. There's probably some theory out there to be found about why here and why not there, but I certainly don't think it was replicable. And I don't know whether we have actually just dodged the bullet or whether we've actually solved the crisis. For the people of the Gambia, it doesn't matter. He's gone, and the nightmare is over. I'll just end with an interesting point on Yahya Jammeh. When President Clinton was going to Africa, maybe in 1996 or 97, all of the NGOs were invited into a meeting at the White House to talk about what he should do, what he should talk about. And I was sitting at the end of the table and I said, well, he's got to go and make a statement about term limits and dictators for life, and he's got to basically commit to the U.S., that the U.S. is determined to see governance in Africa improve. And the high-ranking African official for the Clinton administration took me out. She said, that's the most ridiculous thing. We can't intervene in every single country in Africa. Why would we care about what Yahya Jammeh does? And it was literally about Jammeh. And I said, well, Africa is very much peer-oriented, and there's a hierarchy. If you can't discipline the smallest country, the bigger countries will ignore you. And I lost the argument, but I thought that I was right. So anyway, but it was interesting because that was so long ago, and Jammeh was already moving in an autocratic direction, and nothing was done, and this poor country has suffered under him, and now, thank goodness, they're going to have an opportunity to move towards actually developing, and this brain drain that has crippled the country is going to hopefully reverse itself.
Time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to the AF. So you were speaking earlier about how you were involved in efforts to try and stop U.S. support for the Nigerian security forces in collaboration with the Pentagon. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the specific agenda, because I assume it had something to do with a shift away from the military solution to a more rule of law or good governance solution, but at the same time, a number of times you alluded to the fact that Washington is generally skeptical of such a nuanced approach. So I was just wondering what the specific agenda was in that case. Thank
Yes.
you.
So it's one of those bizarre stories. I had taken the day off to take my car to the mechanic, and I went to the House of Pancakes to indulge, and I suddenly got a phone call, and literally it said, Adate, do you know that General so-and-so and General so-and-so, who are named in your last Amnesty report as being possibly linked to war crimes and crimes against humanity, are here in the United States? And I said, who is this? And then he said, he told me his name, and then I said, no, I didn't know that. I thought that, that they had been fired. And he said, well, it's worse than that. They're not only supposed to have been fired, they're on a no-fly list, which you're not supposed to know about, but they're on the list. And I said, and they're here in Washington? And he said, they're here in Washington. I just met with them. I said, what? And he said, yes, they were given visas over our objections and over the weekend when business shouldn't have been happening. So I then called my other human rights groups and I said, guys, these people are here in Washington, D.C. Can someone confirm this? And what can we do about it? And they said, no. I've got the list of the delegation. These men are not on the list. An hour later, there's a second list. There's an unofficial delegation and there's an official delegation. They're on the unofficial delegation. Who brought them over? Well, they came on their own just by coincidence. So, what for me, the agenda there and the agenda that had dominated the support that we got from the Pentagon was the fact that they were themselves frustrated with the Nigerian military. They had raised concerns of professionalism. They had raised concerns about inefficiencies, about radicalizing the population. And I think they had reached a point where the rejection of the critique and the dismissal of the critique had pissed them off. And so they didn't want to get any closer than they absolutely had to the Nigerian military. And so when the first initial break of, when Boko Haram began to truly sort of take more territory and abduct more people, you may remember that the Obama administration said that they were going to provide intelligence, but they were not going to give intelligence over. They were going to do surveillance and they were going to do aerial activities, but they were not going to give the equipment over to the Nigerian military. And they were going to also provide counselors to help with the due diligence and rule of law and accountability deficiencies within the Nigerian military. The Nigerian military didn't want any of that. They just wanted the guns and they wanted more of them. And that became a major impediment. At the same time, we were producing reports documenting massacres in police and military camps. We were and we had eyewitnesses. We had used satellite imagery to show mass graves. All of them were dismissed roundly. We were attacked by the Nigerian military vociferously. It was almost artistic how we were attacked. And in the end, as I said, the pressure and the fear of Boko Haram actually winning won out. The Nigerian military and the Nigerian government also were vociferous and we need help. You're basically aiding Boko Haram by not supporting us. And then, of course, the critical change was the election of Muhammadu Buhari, and goodbye to Goodluck Jonathan, who was his own worst public relations nightmare. Buhari was a military person. He was much, much more of a man of integrity, and he said that I am going to defeat Boko Haram and I'm going to bring in a clean government into Nigeria, but you have to partner with me to do that. I can't do it by myself. I need to rebuild the military. And the Obama administration and Congress all said that that they basically needed to support this because here was a man that needed to succeed. Nigeria needed to win, not just to defeat Boko Haram, but Buhari's administration needed to succeed. Because there was a real fear that Nigeria could have imploded several times. And certainly the election between him and Goodluck Jonathan was seen as one of those flashpoints. So that was where groups like my own, we lost that strategic argument. Now, 2 years down, Boko Haram has indeed been driven from a lot of the territory that it controlled. It is no longer attacking in as willful and destructive way as possible, but it's still there. It is still conducting attacks in Chad and conducting attacks in Cameroon. But there's definitely been a shift in we have to make the Buhari administration succeed. And there are even now discussions of trying to have the development of a comprehensive plan for Nigeria along the lines of not a very good model, but a model like Plan Colombia, which has had many, many negative repercussions. So that was the agenda, I think, that you're talking about. There was an alignment between a military here that did not want to see itself tarred with the problems of the Nigerian military and also exasperation over, we don't have any problems. We're the best military in Africa. And that alignment worked for a couple of months, a couple of years, and then the election happened and the dynamic changed. And that, I think, has been something that I've been trying to share with the students here, is that this is the challenge that we have. How do you keep injecting human rights into U.S. foreign policy? How do you make it part of the national security equation? How do you make the argument that, if you don't move against this or you don't work to try to reform this, it's going to come back and create a problem? And all too often, we don't win those arguments unless we have support from Congress. And Congress then raises the issue of, we're not sure that you guys know what you're doing, but to move Congress, you need active political constituents. And that's been one of the best things, because I've seen wonderful future constituents and current constituents who I think have to basically hold their members of Congress accountable, who in turn have to hold the executive branch accountable.
Time, please join me in thanking Adeteyo.